Hi, everyone. Well, welcome back to our third and final session of the day, or I guess third panel of the day, fourth session of the day. We're going to talk about the role of public engagement in fostering responsible carbon dioxide removal. My name is Sarah Nawaz. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute, and joining me are three wonderful panelists. We're going to hear today from Ben Rubin, Executive Director and Co-founder at the Carbon Business Council, Vanessa Suarez, who is the Managing Environmental Justice Advisor at Carbon 180, and also Julia Bellotti, who is a research fellow with us at the Institute. And yeah, really excited to hear presentations from all three of these folks. So just a brief overview of this session. We're going to hear a quick presentation from each of our panelists. We'll kind of follow the earlier sessions today and sort of take a few minutes after each presentation for a quick Q&A from the audience. So, keep dropping your questions into the chat. And then once everyone has presented, I've got some questions prepared for a kind of group discussion with everyone. And we're going to definitely reserve some time at the end for some questions for the audience. So with that, Ben, are you ready to kick us off?
Much to Sarah and the team for organizing this. Looking forward to it. Happy to jump in. I will do a screen share and thank you all again for the opportunity to be presenting today. It's great to be a part of the conference and very much looking forward to this panel and digging into some of the questions with my co-panelists and with you all. So yeah, I'm going to kick off the presentation and open things up. And the theme of this is as we scale carbon removal, what is it scale globally as well as at the local level to build support and the interrelated nature of both of those pieces. For anyone who's not familiar with the Carbon Business Council, we're a coalition of more than 100 companies working in the carbon removal ecosystem. The companies are from around the world, and the Carbon Business Council is technology neutral. So we've got every form of carbon removal represented within the coalition. And I think when we're talking about local engagement, it also bears noting that there's some points of commonality across all different CDR pathways, as well as some variations that might take place depending on the different carbon removal pathway that we're talking about and thinking about. To set the table a little bit more as we're talking about scaling up carbon removal and what engagement means, I think we're met with a twin reality here. One is that we have scientific consensus from the IPCC and other scientific bodies that gigatons of carbon removal are needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. When we're thinking about scaling up, what is it going to take? That's going to take all kinds of things from policy interventions to entrepreneurs who are developing to creating a market and having a demand for carbon removal. But one of the things it means is also having buy-in for projects to actually break ground and take place. And so coupled with this gigaton need for carbon removal, I'm highlighting a stat here that comes from Science Direct that shows that if we look at the renewable energy industry, research shows that only 13% of renewable energy projects are completed if there was local opposition once they faced an initial stoppage or delay. This stat specifically refers to renewable energy projects in the US, not global. But I think it shows us here when we're talking about scaling up carbon removal how important community engagement is to really foster buy-in, to be a community steward, to deploy projects in a manner that are maximizing community benefits and minimizing any potential risks. And so to drill a little bit deeper into that, again, with this global local paradigm of what it means to scale up both carbon removal at the global level, where we're talking about gigatons, and then at the local level, what is it meaning for a particular community? I want to put forward here that I think there's different questions that emerge about what does responsible deployment look like globally and what does it look like locally at the local level, both responsible deployment and in community engagement. And as one example for responsible deployment globally, there's a question about as carbon removal scales, how are we thinking about carbon removal scaling in tandem with the important work of reducing emissions? And there's conversations there about twin targets and specificity in net zero pledges to make sure that the work of carbon removal is happening in tandem with emissions reductions. There's questions about monitoring, reporting, and verification of carbon removal to make sure that a ton is a ton of carbon removal being removed. And so these conversations are playing out at the national and international levels. Those questions have direct impacts on a local community, but I think when we're thinking about the suite of considerations at the local level, some of those questions become much more localized. What are the benefits of proposed project for a particular community? Are there any risks, potential risks to a community that should be that community members might have questions about? What's the nature of the carbon removal pathway? And intentionally showing a scale here on that, I think there's a duality where we're talking about scaling carbon removal globally, but ultimately that's going to have a face in particular communities at the project by project level and at the community by community level. Again, different considerations, different dialogues, but very interrelated conversations taking place along both planes.
Ben, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to check if you were trying to advance your slides because I think we're still on the first one.
Oh, sorry about that.
No,
Yeah,
just
let me stop the share and make sure that folks are seeing it. Thanks so much for
yeah,
flagging
and
that. And yes,
thanks to the audience member who caught that.
yeah, thank you. Okay, let me attempt that again on the screen share front. Give me 1 second to pull up the slides here. Folks able to, can you confirm, Sarah, are you able to see when I'm advancing the slides now?
Yes, yes, now we can see.
Okay, thanks for jumping in. Yeah, sorry for missing that. I'll just to quickly go back. This was the About Carbon Business Council slide. This was a stat I was mentioning. We've got a hyperlink here. I'm sure we'll probably share the slides after if anyone wants to do a deeper dive into this particular study. And we were just on the scale side, showing the considerations at the global and local level for carbon removal. And to keep on progressing forward, again, and some of this is I just want to be doing some table setting as we hear from our other panelists about particular considerations and engagement for carbon removal. But I also wanted to share some data from CDR FYI, just as far as a snapshot of when we're talking about carbon removal and we're talking about the carbon removal industry today. What kind of market are we talking about when we're talking about where carbon removal is? More than $3 billion has been spent to date, according to CDR FYI, on carbon removal. There's a quantification here about how many tons of carbon removal have been sold. There's a deeper dive breakdown across different pathways. But the thing that I wanted to flag is carbon removal is in the early days of purchases being delivered. About 3% of the carbon removal that's been purchased has been delivered. And what this translates into and what this equates into for the purposes of our discussion is we're talking about a very high percentage of carbon removal that is going to actively be ramping up in 2025, in 2026, and in the years ahead. And so it's really timely to be having this conversation about community engagement and what does it mean to be a community steward and work to earn support in local communities because of where we are at in this percentage. I think if we were at a different point in time where we're at 90% of CDR delivered or anything else, it's a different conversation. It's a look back, but really this is a look forward and an opportunity to chart together with folks here and with communities. What does community engagement look like? What is the responsible deployment of carbon removal entail? And so to progress forward with some resources and a vantage point from the Carbon Business Council on this, I wanted to share that the Carbon Business Council, in coordination with an advisory committee of experts, we put together what we call CDR-RDT, which stands for Responsible Deployment Trainings. This is a compilation of resources and introductory online training about community engagement, some additional resources from other partners like the Sabin Center that have a template for community benefit agreements, and a whole range of different tools and resources. This is all online. This is free and available to the community. And we would encourage folks to take a look through this. The different trainings and modules, the course takes about an hour to complete. It's been taken by over 800 people to date, I believe, has some of the different tenets of how to think about community engagement early, approaching a community early in the process before project sites have been selected, creating two-way feedback. We won't get into all of the different modules and the full table of contents, but each session consists of a video where we're sharing lessons learned, a test, a quiz to just test comprehension, and then links to resources and further reading. So there's a whole range of materials that have been put together here. And I take the high rate, since we've launched this just a couple of months ago, I take the high rate of folks who have completed the training is just a real signal that there's a real appetite and demand out there for people to want to learn more about community engagement and what it entails and how to do it right and what it means. So we're grateful to the advisory committee who helped put this together and everyone who's completed the training. Wanted to make sure to share that resource. And then just as we look ahead, and I'll close here on this slide and then turn it back to Sarah, is just as we're thinking about what's ahead, as I referenced, carbon removal deployment at the community level, it's going to vary by by the specific CDR pathway and by the particular region that a project is taking place in. This is a map of the US, but really when we're talking about communities, we can be talking about communities globally. We can be talking about communities in the global south. There's going to be a different suite of considerations. But I wanted to highlight here a resource from Roads to Removal that breaks down, this is a very granular map here. If folks go into the report, you can see additional details. Just trying to map out, this map includes different CDR pathways. It overlays with environmental justice index of just where different carbon removal pathways might play out. And I think it gives some interesting cues of what carbon removal conversations might look like in different communities as we're drilling into carbon removal deployment at the local level. And with that, yeah, just wanted to thank Sarah and the IRCR team for the opportunity to present and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks so much, Ben. I don't think I see any Q&A questions in the chat. I might just turn it over to either Vanessa or Julia to see if either of you have questions, but if not, we can move on with Vanessa's presentation.
No questions here.
We'll save them for the end. Vanessa, I think I'm going to share slides for you. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah.
Happy to. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yes. Awesome. Well, first, of course, want to say thank you so much to American University for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Suarez. I'm part of the environmental justice team at Carbon 180, and I'm really looking forward to discussing community benefits and power with you today. Next slide, please. So I want to start with why community benefits are important in the first place for both communities and for developers. So particularly on the technological side, arguably, carbon removal doesn't address pressing community needs. Some of the things that we've heard from communities that we work with are that they're more concerned about access to clean air and water, green spaces, sidewalks, and funding for their community spaces. So by aligning project outcomes with these significant priorities, carbon removal projects can potentially earn community support. And by earning this community support, developers can also achieve higher certainty for their projects, which in turn can help attract investments. And when community benefits become more central to a project, that inherently requires that communities are more meaningfully involved. So in defining the benefits that they want to receive and helping shape projects, communities also share in more power by determining their own future. And when this happens, ultimately, better projects are built, which can help contribute to community flourishing. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you've heard this many times before, but communities are not monoliths. What's a benefit for one community may not be a benefit for another community. And a common mistake that we see is that carbon removal implementers will often enter communities assuming that they know what aspects of their project would be a benefit for that community. So for example, a developer may think that the jobs associated with their project will be a benefit for a community, and then they go to that community and that community maybe doesn't want those jobs or doesn't actually find them meaningful. And so while implementers shouldn't go in making assumptions, doing background research on a community to understand their history and priorities would greatly improve that understanding and help set them up well for community engagement to come, which brings me to my next point. So how do you figure out what is a benefit for a community if you're not going and making assumptions? That really falls on doing good community engagement. And so the first step in good community engagement is being able to identify your community. Communities can be really expansive, and they incorporate groups of individuals who share many different identities and interests. Implementers should determine the boundaries for expected impacts from their project and use that as a starting point to start to hone in on the community and who would be first impacted. Then, through additional conversations, implementers can work with community groups to fully define who constitutes that community. As the engagement process continues and groups have been identified, implementers need to be really careful in avoiding cherry picking who to work with. Implementers also need to create engagement processes that are transparent, consistent, and accessible. So communities need access to key project information, which is kind of getting at the transparency piece around the potential project location, the technologies included, the resources that will be used, and all of the partners involved in order to make informed decisions about that project, whether they want to host it or not, and what benefits they could possibly see. And building on that last piece of accessibility, I want to emphasize the need to dedicate sufficient resources. So many of the communities where carbon removal, especially technological carbon removal, is being deployed are really capacity constrained. They're either dealing with legacy industries and burdens, or they're grappling with other emerging technologies on top of carbon removal, like carbon capture and storage or hydrogen. And so implementers coming into these communities need to do their due diligence of providing support services like childcare, transportation, compensating people for their time and expertise, and then reflecting internally to make sure that they have flexible enough project budgets for the dynamic nature of engagement, or even enough skilled staff on board who can dedicate serious time to engagement efforts. Next slide, please. So one of today's prevailing mechanisms to enshrine community benefits in carbon removal are the Department of Energy's Community Benefit Plans, or CBPs. I'm sure many of you have heard of these by now, but CBPs are a set of planned activities that a developer commits to when they submit an application for federal support, federal funding support. And so yes, that's submitted at the time of application, excuse me. And then DOE will often negotiate the activities within a CBP with the developer before a final contract is kind of set in stone. And then once that final contract is negotiated, CBPs will turn into a set of what are called community benefit commitments. And so these commitments have to be met across project phases in order for a project to continue to receive federal funding. Next slide, please. So the activities within a CBP must detail 4 core priorities that are listed out on this slide. So first, how the applicant has already and will continue to engage community stakeholders. Second, how the applicant will train, attract, and retain a skilled workforce. Third, how the applicant will advance racial equity and equal opportunity. And fourth, how the applicant will advance the Justice 40 initiative of providing economic and environmental benefits to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So truthfully, the future of CBPs is up in the air right now with the incoming administration change. At Carbon 180, we encourage the continued use of CBPs at the federal government level, with some improvements. And so some of those improvements include, first and foremost, involving communities in the creation of CBPs. It seems like across the board, communities have varying levels of involvement in CBPs in their area. This ranges from having no involvement or even awareness of a CBP being created to being very active collaborators. And so we've noticed that the best CBPs are those that are co-created actively with communities. Our second recommendation is creating more specific and accountable requirements. So a lot of guidance for CBPs right now encourages certain activities rather than straight up requiring them. So to address the varying quality of CBPs and ensure that we have uniform high standards, we believe that more requirements around activities should be included. And then third, making CBPs publicly available. Going back to that transparency piece again. Right now, CBPs are not required to be made publicly available to communities or just the general public more broadly. The government is publishing some summaries of some of the projects that have been awarded, but this is not enough transparency for communities. Communities deserve to know kind of what developments are happening in their area and what those CBPs entail. And if they're not made public, communities can't be involved in the first place. Next slide, please. Another mechanism I want to touch on that enshrines community benefits are community benefit agreements, which have been around now for decades. Importantly, these are not the same as CBPs, and in fact, these can be part of a CBP. But CBAs are a legally binding contract between a developer and communities that set forth a range of community benefits for a project. So essentially, a developer says, we will agree to provide these benefits, and communities say, in return for receiving these benefits, we agree to support or at least not oppose your project. Next slide, please. So there are core components that are shared across CBAs. Parties, or the who, basically the developers and the community groups or community coalitions. The benefits, of course, which can encompass a range of areas like local infrastructure development or training and employment. The responses in case something goes wrong. This can look like emergency response plans. And then the remedies if the commitments in the CBA are not being met. So this can include legal mechanisms like arbitration and litigation. Next slide, please. So CBAs can be useful tools for communities, and we have some recommendations to that end as well. First and foremost, making commitments as specific as possible. So in order to ensure that there's clarity across parties and that benefits are accurately delivered, every benefit agreed to in a CBA should almost look like its own agreement. So if a community is asking for an emergency response plan, that commitment should include details on definitions like what constitutes an emergency, the timeline, the monetary amounts, like how often are payouts happening, how should they be distributed, and what is the amount of the payout. Our second recommendation is on delivering ambitious benefits. So CBAs have the opportunity to deliver more creative benefits than other mechanisms like CBPs. And so to that end, we believe that CBAs should really be leveraged to offer these non-traditional benefits, like investments into community funds that are, really driven by the community who decides how they spend that money, or activities that help cultural preservation. And then our third recommendation is around incorporating flexibility. A project site can be bought and sold. Sometimes organizations who signed on to a CBA may close later down the line. And so by integrating different types of mechanisms, CBAs can accommodate these potential changes and make themselves more flexible. Next slide, please. So that's everything that I had. Thank you so much, and happy to pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I'm just checking to see if I don't see any other questions in the chat. So unless, Ben or Julia want to share any questions for Vanessa, we can just quickly hop to Julia's presentation.
Thanks, Vanessa. No questions for now, but I think we'll touch upon a lot of points and things that you mentioned later in the panel. So thank you for your presentation. It's really great. All right, then Sarah will go ahead and share my slides. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Can you see presenter view, or is it just a slide?
I think we do see presenter view, Julia, if you're able to swap to.
Yeah, we are wait a second. I'll just let me see. How about now? Perfect. All right. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and also for Ben and Vanessa for their great presentations. My name is Giulia Bellotti, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, as Sarah mentioned before. And today I will be presenting some preliminary findings from some of the work on community engagement on ocean alkalinity enhancement that Dr. Sarah Nawaz and I have conducted in Washington State. And I think that I'm glad I'm the third presentation of the day because this will represent a sort of case study maybe for the audience, and you can really see what communities do think about carbon removal projects. So, I guess, oops. Perfect. So for the sake of time, I won't be focusing too much on how ocean alkalinity enhancement or OAE works. I guess it is sufficient for this presentation to say that OAE involves adding alkaline substances to the ocean to increase the ability of the ocean to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, marine approaches to CDR, like ocean alkalinity enhancement, have been getting a lot of attention in recent years. And this is definitely partly because of the potential of this approach to remove significant amounts of carbon, since we all know the ocean is a massive carbon sink. So for this reason, research really is advancing and moving from lab studies to field experiments, but perhaps unsurprisingly, social science on marine CDR definitely is lagging behind. In particular, there's really little work that explores not just how general publics think about ocean alkalinity enhancement, but also how coastal communities that, as you can imagine, might be directly impacted by OAE form opinions about it and really think through some of the complexities involved with this technology. And since we believe that proper community engagement is fundamental to advance responsible carbon removal, understanding how preferences form and how to best engage people really is of utmost importance. So our research focused on one particular region where lab studies are advancing to field trials at the moment. We are in Washington State, and more specific on this part of Washington State, which is the Olympic Peninsula. And this is where the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory has been collaborating with this startup called Ebb Carbon on a lab-based approach at the PNNL's SQUIM location that you can see right here on the map. And now Ebb Carbon is planning a field trial that is currently in the permitting stages, and it is supposed to happen at the port of Port Angeles. So what did we do for our study? We conducted 2-day-long workshops with a range of different groups, as you can see here on the slides. Now, these were groups that are operating in the area, and we thought that would be really interested in learning more about ocean alkalinity enhancement. So what we did in these workshops, we first conducted, of course, presentations and discussions more in general about carbon dioxide removal, and also more specifically, of course, about ocean alkalinity enhancement, because again, it's something that, right, people might not know much about it. So we needed to present some, foundational information and knowledge about CDR and OE more specifically. But also we conducted some exercises and some games. And one of those was a best case, worst case scenario, worst case exercise, where we asked people to imagine their worst case and best case versions of ocean alkalinity enhancement in 2050. But really, I have to say that a core element of our workshops was this small group discussion of 4 different scenarios for ocean alkalinity enhancement deployment in the region. And it is to these scenarios that I now turn. So what we did was we broke participants into smaller groups, and we rotated people through discussions of 4 different scenarios of for how ocean alkalinity enhancement might be deployed and implemented in coming years. What you can see here on the right is just one example of our 4 scenarios. We gave a little text and then some information on this table. Unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of time to talk about this in too much detail, but these scenarios really varied across a range of dimensions. So we're talking about, we proposed different types of ocean alkalinity enhancement. We talked about different deployment scales. We talked about, different types of ownership or of monitoring. And of course, these dimensions varied in each scenario so that people could really discuss tensions and trade-offs that arose for them. And so what did we find? So from these workshops, we learned quite a few things, I have to say, about how these participants are thinking about ocean alkalinity enhancement. The first thing I will say is that we learned that it's not just marine ecological impacts that matter to people. We know that those are definitely very important when we're talking about the ocean. Ocean ecosystems are often considered very delicate and sensitive, but people also seem to care about other things. For instance, people seem to care a lot about broader supply chain considerations, broader life cycle considerations. We're talking about energy use, we're talking about mining inputs, we're talking about disposal waste products, but also people were concerned about the social considerations related precisely to these life cycle elements. And then we also found that circular approaches were definitely more supported. And by circular approaches, we mean those that sort of like repurpose existing infrastructure for OAE, or they repurpose byproducts. And the reason why we found that they're more supported is because people really liked to imagine really like to see flexibility in the implementation of OAE. They really like the idea that we could still change course of action. Also, part of this was the fact that people did not really want to see the industrialization of the ocean. They didn't want to see a massive new industry created in the ocean. So they preferred approaches where infrastructure was reused and repurposed. And this was definitely also linked to the preference for OAE to be not something that we do forever, but to be something that sort of has an expiration date. So people were like, well, if we reuse infrastructure, maybe then we have less incentive to continue longer than it's needed. Maybe we can stop once we don't need OAE anymore. And last but not least, among the other findings and aspects, we found that ownership and financing were components that really, really matter to people. More in general, people tend to be quite distrustful of big companies, big corporations, and they have a preference for community, tribal, or public ownership and governance of these technologies and of these projects. And also the funding component for OAE mattered a lot for people. People would like to see funding provided through corporate taxes. So this notion of polluters pay was really, really highlighted in the workshops. Now, we definitely learned a lot about specific preferences that people had, but we also found that some of these preferences were not really set in stone. Instead, we found that when certain issues and questions were discussed, these preferences really varied, and people found themselves navigating through a lot of tensions and a lot of trade-offs. Now, some of these tensions arose when participants were engaging with both questions of climate urgency and questions of scale. Now, some of our participants were quite worried about the climate urgency framing. They did recognize the need to act quickly, but also they argued that climate change is not really the only issue that we're facing today. And so ocean alkalinity enhancement should not really come at the expense of negative ecological or social implications. Now, others, on the other hand, believe that in a climate change world, negative consequences and negative ecological and societal impacts will still happen. They will be there anyways. And so at this point, they said, they responded, maybe it is actually better to act as fast as possible and deploy ocean alkalinity enhancement as fast as we can, because these consequences will happen anyways, right? And then there were also questions of scale. Now, People, for instance, feared that there would be many, many costs and impacts associated with doing ocean alkalinity enhancement and scale. But at the same time, on the other hand, they acknowledged that if we don't do ocean alkalinity enhancement at scale, it might be just pointless. Why are we even doing this in the first place? And similarly, as I mentioned before, community engagement was definitely a preference for many, but people also realized that communities might not be able to implement ocean alkalinity enhancement at scale. And so while the private sector and governments, as I mentioned before, were not like ideal actors, or they were not considered as such by our participants, people thought that they might actually be better able to scale up these projects, and therefore, they could accept that, right? So these are just some examples of tensions and trade-offs, just to say that there were a lot of those that we found during the workshops. So in conclusion, I think that these are just some preliminary findings. So I will be happy to answer some of the questions that you have. But I guess that it's really important to note one point in particular, which is a lot of the pieces of these findings really are a function of the scenario exercise of the scenario method that we used. Regardless of that, we do believe that this method, offering people scenarios, offering people sort of games and activities, really made complexities and unknowns of this technology more tangible and more digestible to participants. And really, tensions were really brought to the surface, and people went beyond sort of like this value-based statements into more nuanced positions as they thought through these complexities. And last but not least, we also saw that people expressed a lot of confidence in their ability to think through these complexities. So I think what this exercise and these activities really demonstrated is that when people are given the right engagement approach, they're really able to engage with the complexities. They're really able to make their own decisions when it comes to projects that are this large and this complex. So yeah, I will stop sharing and pass it back to you, Sarah, in case there was any questions. But thank you so much for organizing this.
Great. Yeah, I'll also invite Vanessa and Ben to pop back on video if you wish to. Thanks so much to all three of you for the great presentations. And I think we have just one question in the Q&A. So we're going to start, but really invite participants to pop your questions into the Q&A. But I'd like to kick us off with a couple questions that I've prepared. So this has been a really great kind of, set of presentations and perspectives we've got sort of more of the private sector side, the NGO and government perspective, and then also the sort of social science academic research perspective that we've brought to the table so far this afternoon. And we've also heard a kind of very, very big picture considerations, but as well as most recently with Julia's presentation, a really deep dive into one specific pathway and location. But I'd like to just take a step back to kick us off and ask if any of you want to share your thoughts on sort of what you think it means to talk about doing public and community engagement well, and also just any reflections any of you have on sort of how you think the carbon removal field is doing in terms of public engagement or good engagement.
I'm happy to kick us off. And I think this is a great question, particularly the second part, to ask communities where the DAC hubs are being deployed right now. But I think what we're seeing in reviewing projects and what we at Carbon 180 have been hearing from communities is that engagement is not going super great right now. It feels like there's a shared understanding that engagement is really important. And then once we kind of move past that point of like, how do you execute on that? That's where a lot of implementers seem to be getting lost. And so what happens is now we're getting engagement processes that either happen too late, after major project decisions have been made, and then communities feel like they don't have any meaningful influence over a project, or it's done in a way that feels really inauthentic. So developers are just holding a town hall to make DOE happy, and they can check that box and like move on to the next funding phase. I also think the way that engagement gets messaged sometimes kind of signals this deeper misunderstanding where like engagement is a benefit of a project rather than this just like necessary process that's part of your due diligence. So to me, good engagement means building community autonomy. And I think Julia's presentation like really touched on this. Like when you give communities the right tools, they can really make decisions for themselves about what they want to see and like what makes sense and like really get into the details. But community autonomy really just means like upholding the rights of communities to like do all of this themselves, like define themselves, define how they want to see carbon removal show up, if they want to say yes or no to a project, and then define like what is a benefit, what is a harm, what is an appropriate repair. And so, yeah, I think for that to happen, like we kind of all touched on this in our presentations, but like you need language justice, you need transportation support, childcare, financial honorariums. And the last thing that I'll say is just, I think community engagement is often explained as a spectrum. Maybe everyone is like so familiar with this spectrum, but it's like the International Association of Public Participation. And so like the higher up the spectrum that you go, the more power that you share with communities. And so right now, I would say that the field is kind of sitting on the lower end of the spectrum. And where we really need to go is like towards the upper end, where we're collaborating and like at least placing partial decision-making power in communities' hands. But I would love to hear from my co-panelists.
Yeah, Vanessa, I can jump in because I really, everything you said right now just resonates with me. And it's really, I might be echoing now what like some of the aspects that you were mentioning, but I really do believe that the first thing that, you know, everyone, whoever is doing community engagement must think about and ask themselves first is, why are we doing community engagement and public engagement in the first place, right? Are we just trying to tick some boxes just because whatever governmental agency requires to do so? Or are we truly interested in actively listening to communities' priorities and concerns? And I do constantly have the feeling that, you know, it's just about ticking these boxes, and also it's just about, oh, we just need, you know, like to do the bare minimum to get this community support. But then other than that, you know, it's everything goes, right? And once again, I think that two crucial points for me are, and you've already spoken talked about these points as well, but I think it's first the importance of involving communities early on in the technology development processes. Too often we see engagement happening when everything has already been decided and established, and this is not really like engagement. And then the second point really is transparency. So are we going to these communities and talking to them about this technology? Like we need to be honest and straightforward when it comes to our intention, when it comes to our positionality, also when it comes to how people's concerns and priorities will be implemented and considered in the implementation of the project. I think that this is something that we see a lot as social scientists going to to these communities and doing these workshops. One of the first questions they ask is, okay, what I tell you today, where does it go? Like, are you actually going to implement it, right? In the decisions, like what's your role here? What's our role here? Where is what we say like being, you know, considered, or where does it go? So I think these are very important points, and I'll leave it here, and maybe Ben, if you want to jump in, or yeah.
The conversation and the comments from Julia and Vanessa, and thanks for the question, Sarah. I think just as we're talking about some of the challenges about community engagement and how communities might respond, I think zooming out, it's also good to be reminded and keep in mind with that stat from the renewable energy industry, whether we're talking about the direct air capture plant or offshore wind or solar farm. There's questions that community members are going to have about multiple forms of climate tech. And so some of what we're talking about might be very specific to carbon removal. Some is just anyone who's in a community who might have a question about what's happening. And so I think with the duality with what the best practices are, it was one of the things that we wanted to try and answer in building out the CDR-RDT training that I was talking about. And that it's about an hour, it's introductory. It's not going to be able to cover all of the deep dives of what it really looks like, but we were able to scan and speak with engagement and project developers and span a gamut of what does it look like. I won't necessarily call out, every tenet of the training right now because I'd encourage folks to check it out. But I think a lot of the points that Vanessa and Julia were making are discussed in the training. One additional one that came up when we were building out the training that I think is compelling is for project developers to think about identifying multiple project sites early in a project's development. And that allows runway when approaching communities to really understand where there's going to be that best mutual fit. Because the goal is to find a community who's going to really be animated about the project. All communities are going to have questions, but as you're moving the ball down the field with any one community, where is there going to be that really good match? And so, in addition to the early outreach, mention that as one additional one, but also just going back to the training because the issues are complex. It's more than any of us as panelists would be able to rattle off all the best practices in this one session or in answer to this one question. I think there's a lot to unpack around that, a lot of really important stuff to unpack.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Next thing I'd love to ask is following a theme that I feel like has been coming up today and probably every kind of CDR event that we're all going to these days, but just really wanting to hear from the three of you around any initial reflections you have on how we should or could be thinking about community engagement during the next administration. Are there sort of specific roles we should be thinking about for kind of other types of funders besides the federal government in terms of what they can do on sort of supporting public engagement? Just welcome any thoughts on that.
To jump in with an initial response here and welcome additional thoughts from the other co-panelists. I think in articulating what we know from polling in the US right now, that one of the issues that Americans are caring about across the board is the economy. I think when we've been talking about community engagement so far and benefits to communities, we've been talking about more than jobs. There's jobs and what else? And we're talking about and defining additional community benefits. I do think communities are going to continue to have questions about the jobs created, the economic impacts to a community, and again, all the other questions that are coming up. But I think seeing the economic benefits of carbon removal, we're talking about the range of co-benefits that it offers. And there's some compelling stats about the amount of jobs that particular carbon removal projects can create in communities, in red and blue communities, in the fact that carbon removal can happen across the US and happen across the world. And so I think we're going to continue to see that discourse play out about how to get carbon removal to scale up and how to secure buy-in at the local level. I also think within the vein of community engagement and deployment of carbon removal, there's also going to be some additional considerations that I think are directly tied to community engagement, but are also taking place on a different track. Some of that, as one to put out, is something that I referenced in the presentation around monitoring, reporting, and verification. When we're talking about carbon removal deployment, having MRV at a project that matters at the local community level. What are any safety mechanisms that are in place? How do we know that a ton is a ton? But for permitting purposes, for securing potentially a private sector buyer of a carbon removal project, these additional variables will also continue to play into the conversation. They have been, and I think they'll continue to. And so I think there's going to be some additional threads to follow community engagement, and within that there's going to be a basket of additional variables and considerations, MRV being one of them.
I can just, oh, Julia, sorry. I'll just hop in with some thoughts and then pass it to you. I think sometimes we lose sight of like engagement has always been done, like it's not new, maybe because carbon removal is new and it feels like we need to figure out how do you do engagement well for carbon removal. But engagement has been part of our regulatory framework for decades now. And when NEPA was created, we had a Republican president. It was Nixon. And so I think that does speak to the fact that engagement is important, regardless of whether we're like in a Democrat, progressive leaning, like political environment. Engagement has been important. It will continue to be important. Maybe there's different ways that we kind of frame it. Stakeholder engagement incorporates or encompasses many different stakeholders, environmental justice stakeholders being one of them, but communities are comprised of many different types of stakeholders. And so I think when we think more broadly about who all is within a community, that can be one way of maybe shifting our messaging around engagement. I think Ben also brought up a lot of great points about how there's a lot of economic and job opportunities associated with carbon removal. And there's so much reporting right now about how a lot of IRA and bill investments are flowing to these Republican, conservative, red districts. And so for these projects to continue getting off the ground, engagement is still going to absolutely be important because we hear a lot about opposition from disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged communities shutting down projects, but white affluent communities are also opposing and rejecting projects. Like NIMBYism is super big right now. And so if we don't continue to invest heavily in engagement, that won't just affect carbon removal, and climate, it's going to affect a lot of different types of projects and industries. And I think also as we're seeing this new administration come in, maybe we don't just focus on the feds. Like a lot of this is going to come down to state governments as well, to philanthropic funders. There's a lot of different pockets to pull from when it comes to thinking about financing projects and getting them off the ground. And so how do we underscore the value of engagement with them? And how do we work with them to also make sure that we have really robust requirements when it comes to just, getting these projects off the ground?
Yeah, Vanessa, I'm so glad you mentioned that last point. That was exactly what I was going to say. There's not just the federal level, there's not just the federal government. There's so many, there's more stakeholders here at play. And I think that what was especially great to learn for me recently is that now some states and some local governments are incorporating project agreements into their development processes. And so, you talked a lot about community benefit agreements. And a good example of this is, amongst the other cities, I think it was the city of Detroit. It was the first one in 2016, which became the first city to introduce and also pass a community benefits ordinance, which means that developers who receive local public subsidies above, a certain threshold, which I don't remember on the top of my head, but they are required to negotiate benefits with a local advisory council that, again, it's supposed to represent community. There's a lot to say about that, like we can still improve, but I think it's a great starting point. And it's not just happening at the very local level, it's happening at the state level. We have New Jersey. This is another example of a state that institutionalized community benefit agreements at the state level. And I think this is all great. This is an important first step, and other municipalities and states could follow that example and, try to leverage that. And once again, echoing what you said, Vanessa, yes, community engagement is not something that has only existed under Democrats and Democratic governments. I mean, we really need to, I guess, leverage what we have right now to keep the ball rolling and keep doing community engagement well. I also guess that the role of think tanks and research institutes in doing that, like, the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal, we need to keep pressing and pushing for developers, but also other entities to do community engagement and do it well.
All right, next question. I wanted to kind of make a nice note to the Will's overarching kind of theme for our conference today, which is the emerging regulatory terrain of CDR. I don't know if any of you were on the previous session where Ramani Webb talked a bit about public engagement from a sort of more regulatory perspective, but I wanted to ask around, I kind of wanted to, touch on this point of regulation and the intersection between regulation and engagement. So my observation is that, and it's already come up in this panel so far, but regulations sort of tend to include some type of engagement in it. We can see that in various different instances. Julia just started to talk about this to some extent. But I'd love to just chat and hear from the three of you or any of you that want to comment on this, on sort of the upsides and downsides of sort of mandating engagement via permitting or sort of regulatory processes. Is there sort of a benefit to it? Is there a downside to it?
I can kick us off, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, I would love that. I also want to say upfront, I am not a JD. I'm not an expert in permitting. Really defer to others, maybe in the audience who know more than myself. But But I think kind of how we've alluded to already in our conversation, like engagement is not new and it's been a core part of our regulatory framework for a long time now. And there's been a lot of buzz about permitting reform and reducing public engagement requirements because that will help with the urgency of building out more projects and making sure we can fast track things. And I'm at least not sure that that's necessarily the answer. I know we can point to NEPA and a lot of these other permitting processes that have actually safeguarded our most vulnerable communities for a long time now. And if I've learned anything from our community partners through working at Carbon 180, it's that our current regulatory regimes are actually not sufficient enough when it comes to community engagement. But maybe like taking a step back in terms of like what should be included, I think like everything that we've already been talking about, like we need to be aiming for a floor, I mean, a ceiling, not a floor. We need to be aiming for a ceiling, not a floor. So proactiveness, like transparency, accessibility, flexibility to community input, and also community visioning. I think Ben raised this earlier. How can developers be thinking really early on about different project sites for what they want to do? And I actually think some of our permitting processes like NEPA really lend themselves to this, like some of those project alternative requirements. I've heard instances where one of the alternatives pursued was actually like a community vision that was put forward and ended up being the successful project that went through. And so I think, yeah, our regulatory requirements need to make more space for this. Communities want to be more central. They don't want to be sidelined. And some specific things that I have heard from our community partners is like a desire for more than one comment period. Comment periods right now feel really short to communities who, like I've said, are inundated with either legacy industries, other new industries. There's a lot going on. The current comment periods are super short. And we're noticing a lot of projects now, especially in carbon removal, operate in multiple phases. So whether it's like a DOE funded project or other types of projects, they have different phases before they can continue. And communities have expressed they want the opportunity to comment at each of these phases to say like, yes, it deserves continued funding or not. Communities have also noticed that some Class 6 wells that have been permitted end up having these like really big project changes during the permitting process. But then there's not a new comment period to comment on the project after a big change has happened. And so that feels very frustrating and unfair that it's kind of a different project than the one you originally commented on, but now you don't have an opportunity to comment on those changes. And so I think these are just a couple of examples of like what we're hearing from communities with current gaps in our current regulatory framework. And so I would challenge that like we should not be advocating for reduced engagement. We need improved engagement. And communities deserve to have a say for like what shows up in their area.
Yeah, Vanessa, I'm so glad you brought up this point of public hearings and public comment periods. I was reading that report that you were mentioning by the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And I couldn't help but noticing really the emphasis on this public comments periods and public hearings. And we know from talking to communities, we know this because, yeah, they tell us all the time that these are not the best approaches for community engagement. People tell us that they often feel like public hearings and comment periods are this sort of one-way, one-side engagement process where they find themselves sort of shouting and screaming at governments and developers that they don't want this project or like that this is wrong and this other thing is wrong. But they don't really find that this process is a process where their concerns are actually truly heard and ultimately considered in the implementation phase and in the deployment phase, which brings me back, of course, to the point that I was mentioning before about, like transparency. We need to get to the communities and tell them, this is how we will be listening to you. This is where what you say is being like actually implemented, right? And as another example that I can briefly talk about is the Environmental Protection Agency's Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, or NPRRSA. So the MPRSA requires public engagement, right? But what they mean by public engagement, once again, is basically a public hearing if requested by the community, by the way, and again, a public comment period that, again, we know it's sometimes too short. It falls short of all the aspects that we've said already, right? And we've mentioned already when answering the first question. And we saw this in action recently during the permitting for an ocean alkalinity enhancement trial off the coast of Massachusetts. And this was the first marine CDR trial conducted under the MPRSA. So it's an important one, right? Because we know that as the first one, it might set a precedent. But we also know that things did not really go well. There was a lot of opposition there by various community groups, not only environmental organizations, but also, fisheries groups. And the trial was eventually ultimately significantly delayed. So I think this is a great lesson learned, and it should be a lesson learned for the government, but also for other developers and organizations and that come in and want to do these projects, because when it comes to the complexity of CDR projects and technologies, public hearings and public comment periods are just not enough. There's definitely an educational component needed, but also there needs to be more co-production of knowledge with communities. And we know that a public hearing and public comment periods and sessions are not able to reflect this complexity.
Great point from the co-panelists here. I think I would just also add in the context of this question about regulatory frameworks and permitting, because permitting reform is likely to be a hot policy topic in 2025, I think this question is going to continue playing out in the months ahead. So it'll be one for folks to stay tuned to. I also think within that context, there's going to be questions about the responsibility of engagement and where it sits. And so there's going to be ongoing questions about the role of regulatory requirements. But in the context of the private sector, if there's an investor diligencing a carbon removal project or a potential buyer of carbon removal looking at a carbon removal project, they're going to be looking at a range of factors. What's the cost per ton? Is there an MRV framework in place? But from a risk assessment perspective, understanding, is there a community that's supportive? What will the deployment look like? What's the viability of this happening? There's also private sector considerations to the need that will continue to drive community engagement to happen, just from the perspective of how can a project be de-risked? How can carbon removal take place? And so I think that these conversations about community engagement, they'll continue, again, through permitting reform, so folks should stay tuned for that, as well as continue in other realms and planes as well. And so there'll be a larger landscape where these discussions are taking place in the future.
Okay, I have a couple of questions left, but we also have gotten a bunch of great audience questions. So I think I'm just going to ask one more question of my own and pair it with a question from the audience that is sort of in a similar vein, and then we'll just properly turn to audience questions. So I really just wanted to ask, about this tension that I often encounter in my own work. Julia mentioned this in her talk. About this trade-off between deploying fast on the one hand, we need to address climate change, and then on the other hand, we need to move carefully to make sure we're not causing harm. I'm just wondering how we should think about that balance between deploying fast and deploying justly, and just would love reflections from you all on that. And I'll add a participant question from Devin Todd, who asks, he also struggles with the tension between urgency and the pace of proponents doing project by project engagement with all the sort of risk involved. And he specifically asks about what role or opportunity could larger jurisdictions take to pre-zone for different CDR solutions. So I don't know if any of you want to comment on pre-zoning or zoning questions, but sounds like he's also pointing out something that I feel like I'm always talking about, which is this project by project engagement framework, which is sort of the default for how we tend to think about engagement in projects, particularly in the US and Canada. I'll let anyone who wants to jump in go for it.
I can kick us off. Thank you so much, Sarah and Devin. This is such a fascinating question. And as you mentioned, Sarah, it's something that many of us in the climate and community engagement space are constantly grappling with. But I have to say that after many, many reflections and conversations, especially with colleagues working in the environmental justice space, I came to the conclusion that I generally don't think that there has to necessarily be a trade-off between justice considerations and the urgency of, the energy transition and climate action, which of course includes the deployment of CDR. Now, this is not to say that genuine community engagement does not take time. We know that community engagement done well, which is a pillar of a just energy transition, in my opinion, involves building relationships, and therefore it takes time. It does take time. But when I personally think about all the things that are slowing down climate action right now, including, of course, the deployment of carbon removal technologies, doing carbon removal justly and just deployment is not really like one of the first things that come to mind. It is actually quite the opposite, right? Because we know that community opposition sometimes stops and often delays deployment all the time. And something I do want to recognize, as others have, of course, before me, is that the urgency debate surrounding climate change really, really risks justifying, delegitimizing alternative forms of, cultural knowledge and alternative solutions in the name of fast deployment of green technology. And at this point, I think that, from here, where do we go? I think we have two different roads that we could take. One is we use this urgency framework as a justification to proceed with a transition that is just imposed on local communities, including carbon removal technologies. And this clearly eventually does not lead to just outcomes, right? If anything, it will be just a continuation of business as usual scenarios, a continuation of the status quo, where yes, maybe we're able to shift to greener forms of energy, but we do so at the expense of communities who have been historically marginalized, who will still bear the burden of the transition, who won't truly be able to steer it in the direction they want to, and they will likely still be victims of, like exploitation and land thefts, and at the center of like these processes of dispossession and extraction. Or I guess there's another way we can go, which is we can actually use the urgency of the climate crisis to instead open up to different perspectives, to different worldviews. And again, community engagement plays a huge role in this, right? And this means that we basically accept the fact that there are different ways of making this transition happen. There are different ways of deploying carbon removal, or even not deploying it if that's what certain communities want. And this really means making community engagement embedded in technology development so that communities are truly involved in the co-creation of, these alternative futures, and justice eventually is pursued. And my belief is really that this latter way, this latter road, is actually the most efficient and the fastest way to transition, just because by nature it opens up to more possibilities, to more imaginaries, and just to the co-creation of these alternative futures that are just like richer by definition. And yeah, I think that proceeding with deployment with an implementation too fast, eventually it will backlash. It will eventually actually slow down deployment. It will slow down the transition, which has to be just. And Devin, I don't know if this actually addresses your question, but I think that part of doing this in a just way means that we have to stop doing engagement eventually project by project. Eventually it would be amazing to have like an entity that, like goes community to community, and instead of proposing, like that specific project, it actually discusses with communities, what do you want? What kind of transition are you envisioning for your community? Because CDR might work for some communities, it might not work for others. And so do different forms of renewable energy, right? So I think that I just want to stop here because other people might be able to better answer this question. But yeah, this is what I think.
All great points. Yeah, I'll just quickly add in and say I think in this case it's both and rather than an either or. When we look at the projections from the IPCC of how quickly we need to scale up removal and the gigatons that we want to be at by 2030, and we being what scientific projections are saying for the role of carbon removal working in tandem with emissions reductions, it's there's a lot of growth ahead over the next few years. But the question isn't only how do we grow to hit there? It's really how do we grow and set up carbon removal to function effectively and be a good steward in for the long duration. So I think the answers that both Vanessa and Julia are giving show that there's a pathway forward for both to happen, that we can deploy carbon removal, but that carbon removal can also be deployed responsibly.
Yeah, I think both of my co-panelists like really touched on this well. And the last piece that I'll add, I just kind of want to build a little bit on Julia's last point. I think there's a clear need to like build the capacity of communities to engage in carbon removal. And so we need to kind of put them in a place where right now communities are operating almost in defense. A project comes into their community and then they have to come up with a response to what they think about that project versus being on more of a proactive side where they are invited into a safe space, given the resources that they need to think, what are all the configurations of DAC? What are the potential ways that it can be made? Like, how can we do some really active community visioning of all the different ways that DAC could look in our community? And then we're able to specify these are the exact conditions under which we would accept a DAC project or which we wouldn't. And that, I think, would greatly accelerate the process in the long run, instead of having to do it project by project in a reactionary sense. So I think the impetus here is really for those with the deep pockets to start investing in communities and helping them to get on the same page and coordinated and just ready to kind of put their vision out there. And there are communities who are already starting to do this. I don't think it's always like they're on the defense. I've actually seen some communities who know like carbon management is coming to us. Like we're going to start doing our own organizing and come out with our own platforms of like what we want to see. And so I would encourage that as like part of your background research when you want to do community engagement, see if these platforms already exist. Maybe they're not exactly for carbon removal, maybe they're for CCS, but what are the lessons or key takeaways that you can pull out from that and start to use that as you're figuring out, does my project actually make sense in this community or not?
Great. Well, next, I wanted to touch on a theme that came up in a couple of audience questions around sort of public climate literacy. So Michael Hayes asks, we have ample proof that rather large communities can and will deny anything science-based while verified facts. Is there room to deal with that phenomena? And Raz Mason, apologies if I'm pronouncing anyone's name incorrectly, asks, can you drill down more on where public literacy RECDR considerations is lacking? In my experience, these might include basic science, complex system dynamics, economic drivers, and tipping points. Curious about whether you agree on these or others, and follows up later by asking, my hunch is that addressing knowledge deficits, misunderstandings, will help unlock public support when appropriate, in addition to listening deeply to community concerns knowledge. So yeah, I don't know if this is maybe a question any of you in particular want to speak to around, how much have you observed that this kind of knowledge deficit or sort of lacking climate literacy is impacting how these, kind of engagements look or kind of should look?
I'll just start quickly. I feel like Julia has amazing thoughts, and Ben as well. But one, I also want to caution us that like community education shouldn't be done to achieve an outcome of getting support for something. I think if that's how you're going into it, it's already going to backfire. Like communities can tell when you're going into meetings with them and you have a like predetermined expectation or outcome that you want from them. And that's already going to like put you backwards in terms of building trust and trying to earn support. But I will say, I think education is growing, or like community awareness and education of carbon removal is growing, but it's still relatively low. And so, of course, that deeply impacts engagement, because for free, prior, and informed consent to really happen, right? For communities to say in good faith, like, yes, we want this project and like we are so excited about it. They have to like have a pretty good level of education and like understanding of carbon removal and whatever the technologies are and whatever the implications are. And so since that's just generally not given like across the board right now for most communities, like, yes, there are really big, I would say, like literacy or education awareness gaps. And so again, kind of just building on what I said before, like I think that's step one. Like people need to be able to have access to that information and those resources to figure out like what they actually think or not. Um, and yeah, maybe I'll just pass it to my co-panelists.
I agree with everything you just said, Vanessa. It was beautifully put and something that is really fresh in my mind. And thank you for asking these questions. These are very important questions. Last week, actually, so it's really fresh in my mind, we ran a community workshop. Actually, it was a public workshop. So these were just, like sort of randomly sampled and selected members of the Metro Vancouver area in BC, Canada. And I was actually ready to hear a lot of, maybe like climate denial and a lot of negative comments when it comes to CDR, especially, right? But I was surprised by, like after we presented, we always start our workshops by presenting this, like very basic information about climate change, very basic information about what carbon dioxide removal is, how it works. And there were a couple of people who said specifically this to us. They said, oh, but then what we heard on television about, probably they heard some, climate misinformation or, going on television. They were like, oh, but then, it's not true. These actually make sense. So sometimes or oftentimes we do underestimate the community's abilities to understand these issues. And once they really were, and I would echo what Vanessa said, I think that we were able to have this conversation because we positioned ourselves as independent researchers. We were not there to, push the project forward. We were not there to impose like a specific project on the community, where we're there just to say, hey, this is happening. What do you think? We're just independent social science researchers. And all of a sudden, people were just way more open. I don't think that the reaction would have been the same if we, if we were, let's say, the developer who's proposing this project, right? There's still a lot of trust in independent, maybe researchers, in community members, independent community members, rather than maybe project developers coming to the community and saying, hey, this is what we know. So I think that, we were really positively surprised by how this information was welcomed by this specific audience at the workshop.
Great point. Yeah, and I think I just also weave in that when approaching community, it's a discussion about carbon removal, and it might be a discussion, and it is a discussion about a particular project depending on the community. But it's also a discussion about the co-benefits of carbon removal and how those co-benefits overlay with the community. And so, in the case of talking about biochar, carbon removal is one of the co-benefits, but also fertilizing soil for a farmer adds another co-benefit. Or if we're talking about spreading out rock or enhanced weathering on farmland, and we're opening up an additional revenue source for a farmer, it might be about the economic benefits. And so it's not necessarily that it is isolated to one plane. Different communities might be more drawn to a project because of some benefits. Those benefits don't necessarily null and invalidate the other co-benefits, but it's a suite of benefits that's going to be presented to a community that might work to secure the buy-in. Carbon removal being one of the many on the list. And as we go through the different CDR pathways, each one offers a host of different unique benefits. And I think when we start to tally up those co-benefits and think about carbon removal across the board, just in some of the public polling that's come out about carbon removal, it's generally been viewed favorably and positively by Americans. It's positive, supported, and also bipartisan support for it. I think that many co-benefits that carbon removal provides is one of them. And so the polling also shows that public awareness of carbon removal is low, but seeing that generally there's strong support for carbon removal when asked about it is encouraging for when we're talking about the community engagement that's ahead and where rubber is going to hit the road for actual project build out.
Amazing. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to pair two not connected questions, and you all our panelists can pick which one they want to answer. The first is a question from David Anderson, who asks, is who pays for carbon removal and where do the profits flow part of the engagement dialogue with the local community? And the second question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, do you think the DAC Hubs program should require community engagement before the project receives any funding? How could this be done for a TA1 or feasibility versus a TA3 construction project? So kind of getting back to some of this sort of regulatory questions maybe around yeah, I guess also, this question touches on sort of different uh, scales or requirements for engagement depending on sort of the stage of the project. So if anyone wants to answer either of those questions.
I'm happy to get us started on a specific question, which is David's question on is who pays for carbon removal and where do the profits flow part of the engagement dialogue with the local community? Yes, definitely it is. We specifically in the work that I presented earlier with the local community in Sequim and in the Olympic Peninsula, it was a point that came up a lot. As I mentioned there, people really wanted to see polluters pay, and they did not want to see this happening through. Is my internet connection okay? I saw a little glitch there, but so people told us, well, if this is happening, if I'm paying for this through, like income taxes, I don't think that this is fair. That's what they told us, because they really see polluters and large corporations having to pay for those projects. So I do believe that this is, part of it has to be part of the conversation with local communities. We do have to also talk about who funds these projects and how it works. People are definitely interested in that. Now, I would mention that maybe part of it is because, in this scenario exercises, we did prompt for, like funding mechanisms, but definitely communities seemed to be interested in these aspects. And I think that, yes, it should be part of the conversation.
I can follow up here and maybe kind of take this conversation a little zoomed out. Just building on what Julia just said. Yes, definitely needs to be part of engagement. And I think sometimes surprisingly for implementers, like communities care more about actors than they do about the technologies themselves. And even as a nonprofit trying to build relationships with community organizations, one of the first questions we get all the time is like, who's funding you? Like, where do you get your money from? And also, like, what do you use your money for? And so this isn't just, I think, specific to projects. I think in general, like communities have these questions because they know, like they've suffered at the hands of a lot of these actors, and they've seen money go through the community, but not stay in the community. And so that's really where the impetus for a lot of these questions come from. So having those stats or like information from the beginning ready is going to do a lot in terms of building those first steps when it comes to trust and showing like what your intentions are, why you're showing up in this community, who you have on board, because again, that can be more important than the technology that you're putting forward itself. For the second question on DAC hubs and requiring engagement up front, my first reaction is yes. And I don't have a perfect answer for how that should be shown. But I will say, I think something I would encourage, just even for best practice for like themselves to stay on top of what's happening, is like this idea of like a track record of engagement. Like community engagement is so complex. There's so many different groups you're going to talk to. There's so many different ways conversations can be happening. You need to constantly follow up. You need to know what was the last thing that you talked about with someone? What are the follow-ups that you owe them? Who else do they know? Are they talking to each other? What coalitions do they have that you need to show up at? Like, can you show up to this meeting? And so having some type of like track record of all of this helps you and your company to figure out like what's going on and like, what do I need to do next? And it could also be used maybe when you're applying for federal assistance or assistance from some other entity to show them like, this is everyone we've talked to. These are all the different ways that we have tried to engage in conversations. And then maybe a little status update, like we never got a response here. This group said that they're interested in learning more if we're able to show them like XYZ thing. Transparency, I feel like, has been a huge theme of the conversation, and having a track record like that, even for communities to see, like, let them see who you've talked to and like what the status is. I think that can also build a lot of trust for them to understand, like, oh, you've already talked to this group. Okay, maybe we should talk to you too. Not a perfect answer, but maybe an idea.
Helpful responses again from the co-panelists. I think just a quick additional point or two from me is to go back to that CDR-RDT training. One of our motivations in putting it together, just because I think there was a question about how early a technology readiness level or project developer might be in the phase. Folks don't have to be starting from the ground zero every time they're thinking about community engagement. The more that I think the civil society community and associations can pull together resources and best practices and have templates and guides, the more resources that project developers will have. And so project developers don't necessarily have to go at this alone. I think there's questions of what can we build on, where can we draw on resources, learn. Without just to add one additional element in too, because Vanessa was just commenting on public sector funding. Thinking about community engagement and securing community buy-in to secure private sector financing also enters into the equation. I think if someone's interested in purchasing carbon removal credits, they want to know how likely is this going to be delivered. If you have a project site, how far along are you in making sure that there's community buy-in at that project site? And so some of these same questions that play out here, again, whether it's necessarily regulatory required or a private sector buyer asking or a private sector investor asking, similar questions are going to arise about what level of community buy-in is there, because a journey ahead where there's not community buy-in or strong community opposition is a difficult road for project deployment.
I'm sad that we won't be able to answer all of the or talk about all of the questions that the participants, or sorry, the I guess yeah, participants in this call shared, because we've got some great questions that are going to go unanswered. But I just wanted to give, in the interest of time, just give our panelists a quick chance to share any final thoughts you have, questions that have come up that haven't been answered that you really want to speak to, or just other sort of reflections coming out of this panel. So I invite all of you to do that if you want. And after that, I'd love to turn it back to Will to close us out for the day.
I think what I will say, and Will love this, I think that we really need to move, and Vanessa mentioned this engagement scale. I think we need to move towards deliberation, community deliberations, right? I think that communities, somehow we need to develop some mechanisms where communities are in charge of these projects, where communities like decide how they are implemented, where they are implemented, who benefits, who pays the cost as well, right? I think that I will close it on a positive note, saying that communities are completely, absolutely able to make this type of decisions. They're absolutely capable of dealing with this complexity, although some developers might not believe so, and come up with great solutions. And they are definitely, we've heard so many great, insights from participants that have participated previously in our workshops. And I think that now it is really a matter of taking all these best practices for engagement and applying them to the CDR world, because we have them, they're out there, communities have the capacity to really decide for themselves. And this is where we need to move. Yeah. So, and thank you so much for my great co-panelists for all the insights shared today. I think it was great. I'll pass it to one of you to close us off.
I'll jump in quickly. Yeah, just so grateful again. And my co-panelists have shared so many amazing insights. I think my big message for today is like, good carbon removal isn't just about carbon. It's like about the benefits that your projects can also deliver to communities. And that's determined by communities. That's not determined by you by yourself as a carbon removal implementer. Just on the last question, I was looking something up in my notes to the piece on community engagement for DAC hubs, or just kind of a track record. Something I learned from one of our community partners is this idea of a multi-stakeholder auditing system. I don't know all the details, maybe look it up, but essentially, this is supposed to be a system that can help ensure that developers aren't just cherry picking which community groups they talk to. And so conveniently, like EJ and social justice groups are like sidelined, and then the project continues forward anyway. So I think that's an example of a mechanism that has been put forward by communities to make sure that there is this like level of accountability. But yeah, I'll leave it there and pass it to Ben.
Great, and I'll be brief to get over to Will soon to close this out. Just yeah, gratitude to Will and Sarah and Seth for organizing this. It's exciting. It feels like a milestone that it's the fourth one. If we look back at the first convening to now, it's just amazing how much has been happening in carbon removal. When we come back around this time next year to see how much will have happened between now and then. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and joined us and to co-panelists. I think just to take away from me is the organizations on the line have terrific resources. Many of the attendees on the line have terrific resources. At the Carbon Business Council, we've got CDRLP, which I was mentioning. We put out a bi-weekly newsletter rounding up carbon removal news. So as folks are thinking about how to take a deeper dive or how to think about approaching community engagement, you don't necessarily have to start from that square one. There's a lot out there to tap into, to read up on, to engage in, to share your feedback on. And so I think thinking about this wealth of knowledge that already exists is great to be tapping into and exploring further. So with that, thank you everyone again, and we'll turn it over to Will.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was a great panel and inspiring final moments from you, Ben. My job here is almost done. So I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today. When you look at this field of carbon removal, obviously there's a lot of challenges in terms of technology and in terms of economics and so forth. But in parallel to that, right, it's incumbent upon us to get the regulation and notions of equity and justice correct, both from an ethical perspective and from a practical perspective. Because if we don't, surely these projects will not move forward, right? And so it's always our goal in this conference to try to highlight those issues that we think don't get highlighted as much, perhaps in other fora as they need to, and hopefully in this small way, this is done so again, and we'll continue to do this in the future. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye now.